Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Arkansas Ozark Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and what time you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. It was especially hard in the remote valleys of Newton County, Arkansas, during the winter of 1887. It had snowed early that October, covering the rough ground of The Ozark Mountains were in a heavy silence that seemed to muffle even the wind. It was in this remote wilderness, where families lived miles apart and neighbors were counted in hours of travel instead of minutes, that one of the most planned and psychologically damaging hunting campaigns in American frontier history would take place. It all started with what looked like a simple theft. Maury Hatfield, the head of a clan that had moved to Buffalo Creek about 15 years earlier, owned a moonshine still that had been taken apart and moved on the night of October 3, 1887. The still, a complex copper device that was worth a lot of money at the time, not only cost them money, but also broke the unwritten rules that kept people alive in these mountains. Maury Hatfield was not the kind of person who showed his feelings or made quick decisions. At 52, he had lived through the Civil War, many harsh winters, and the constant threat of federal revenue agents who sometimes came through the hills looking for illegal distilleries. People in Newton County thought of him as a man who didn't say much, but when he did, his words were always true. People who knew him said he was tall and thin, with piercing gray eyes and hands that rarely moved without a reason. The Hatfield homestead was at the end of a narrow valley. The only way to get there was by a single dirt path that went through thick oak and hickory forests. The main house, made of hand-hewn logs, faced east toward the creek. The outbuildings went back towards the trees. Maury had run his still for more than 10 years without any problems in a carefully hidden hollow behind these buildings. When Maury found out about the theft on the morning of October 4th, he didn't tell his family right away. Instead, he spent the day carefully looking at the site, looking at every footprint, broken twig, and change in the soil. Temperance's wife kept a journal that was found in 1963. After the renovation of an old church in nearby Jasper, Maury went back to the house that night and said, 12 men took what was ours. 12 men will answer for it. There is no record of how Maury came up with this number. A report from the county sheriff filed weeks later said that there were too many footprints around the still site for them to be counted with certainty. But Maury was still sure of the number, and over the next few weeks, this exactness would become almost like a ritual. At that time, the Hatfield family was made up of Mororte, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult sons: Zedekiah, who was 28, Phineas, who was 26, and Odiah, who was 23. The sons were known in the community for being quick to anger and always ready to fight, unlike their father. Zedekiah, the oldest, had been in prison in Little Rock, Arkansas, for assault. 2 years before, Phineas was thought to be involved in the disappearance of a revenue agent, but no charges were ever brought against him. Put in. Obadiah was the youngest, but he was probably the most feared because he could track anyone through the thick Ozark wilderness, which scared the locals. After the theft, the Hatfield family seemed to start a planned campaign to gather information all over the county. They went to general stores, church services they had been avoiding, and talked to neighbors they hadn't seen in years. Many people thought this sudden friendliness was strange. It was strange, but not many people asked about it directly. Because mountain families were often cut off from other people, they would try to reconnect with their communities every now and then. Later, county officials were told that the questions the Hatfields asked made these interactions especially unsettling. They asked about recent purchases of copper tubing, who might have been driving on the mountain roads on certain days, and which families had suddenly come into money or resources that they couldn't explain. The questions were asked in a casual way, as part of bigger talks about the weather and crops, but together they made a complete picture of who might have had the means, the chance, and the reason to steal the still. Bartholomew Wickham, who ran a general store in nearby Parthenon, later talked about one of these visits from Zedekiah Hatfield in November 1887. Wickham's story, which was recorded in a statement to the Arkansas State Police in 1923, says that Zedekiah spent more than an hour in the store, buying small things and talking in what seemed like a friendly way. During this time, though, he kept asking about every customer who had bought a lot of grain, coal, or copper items in the last few months. Wickham said he wasn't threatening, but the way he asked things made it seem like he already knew the answers and was just checking to see if you'd tell him the truth. It made a man think that every word he said could be wrong. By December, the Hatfield family had apparently narrowed down their list of 12 suspects by 1887. It was still not clear what the criteria were for this identification process, but when the list was finally found among family papers in 1965, it showed a pattern that suggested careful thought about both opportunity and ability. The men were between 22 and 55 years old, lived within 15 miles of the Hatfield property, and either knew how to take apart a complicated distillery or had shown hostility toward the Hatfield family in the past. The list included Cornelius Ashworth, a blacksmith who had turned down the chance to fix Hatfield's tools, Silas Peaton, who had fought with Morai over property lines 3 years earlier, and Jeremiah Quincy, whose own still had been destroyed by tax agents and who might have needed new tools. It looked like the other people on the list had been added for less serious crimes. Nathaniel Bramley, who had been heard making fun of the Hatfield family's record in the war, Ezekiel Tanner, who had been dating, Temperance Hatfield before she married Morai, and Augustus Cromwell, who had testified against Zedekiah during his assault trial. What happened next was not a typical fight on the frontier or a series of violent acts of revenge. Instead, the Hatfield family started what can only be called a campaign of psychological warfare to systematically ruin the mental health and social standing of each man on their list. Cornelius Ashworth started the campaign. His wife's testimony to A. In 1888, Ashworth was a traveling preacher. In 1967, church records were found that showed he started getting anonymous messages left at his smithy. These weren't normal threats. They were detailed accounts of his daily life, descriptions of his private conversations with his wife, and information about his business dealings that no one else should have had. The messages became more and more personal about Ashworth's life. They talked about where he had money. He talked about injuries he had gotten years ago and never told anyone about them. He also talked about childhood memories that he had only shared with his wife. It was clear what the meaning was. Someone was keeping an eye on him, listening to his private conversations, and had access to information that should have been impossible to get. Ashworth's mental health quickly got worse. He began to check and recheck the locks on his store, and he would stop talking to listen for sounds that others couldn't hear, and started keeping a loaded rifle next to his bed at night. He got more and more paranoid and distracted, which hurt his work. People who worked with him saw his hands shaking and heard him stop working to stare out the windows as if he was waiting for someone to see him. The campaign against Silas Peaton changed shape. Peaton was a proud man who cared more about what people thought of him in the community than anything else. Instead of threatening him directly, the Hatfields started spreading carefully planned lies about his character and how he did business. People in the community didn't think these rumors were obviously false, but they were bad enough to slowly hurt his reputation. There were rumors that Peaton had been seen meeting with federal tax agents in secret. Other rumors said that he had been cheating customers in his timber business by selling them bad wood at high prices. Some people even hinted at bad behavior, relationships with women who are already married in the area. Each rumor was believable, hard to prove wrong, and hard to prove right. As his neighbors began to treat him with suspicion and distrust, Piton felt more and more alone. Customers took their business elsewhere, which hurt the business. People in the church stayed away from him, and he stopped getting invitations to social events. Because this social isolation happened slowly, it was especially bad for Piton because he could never point to one specific act or accusation that had damaged his reputation. The psychological attack on Jeremiah Quincy was mostly about keeping his family safe. Quincy and his wife lived in a cabin in the woods with his elderly mother. Their nearest neighbor was several miles away. The Hatfields took advantage of this isolation by making it seem like the family was always being watched and in danger. Quincy would wake up to find that his animals had been moved to different fields overnight, with gates left open in ways that made it seem like someone had done it on purpose instead of them getting out by accident. Things would go missing from his barn, only to show up days later in places he knew he would find them, but in patterns that looked like they were planned and had meaning. After a fresh snowfall, footprints would show up around his house in a neat pattern that suggested someone had been watching every window and door closely. The sounds that Quincy and his family started hearing at night were probably the scariest. Quincy's wife wrote a letter to her sister that said, "In 1962, family papers in Missouri included these sounds, which sounded like a lot of people moving through the woods near their cabin, but always staying just out of sight. The noises would go on for hours, even all night, but they would stop suddenly whenever Quincy tried to find out what was going on." Quincy's family was under even more psychological stress because they were completely alone. They couldn't tell if the threats were real or made up, and they couldn't get help without going somewhere else. Dangerous distances, and they couldn't shake the feeling that an unseen enemy was terrorizing them on purpose, knowing every move they made and every weakness they had. The fight against the 12 men got stronger as winter went on. People Nathaniel Buramley didn't know started coming to see him and saying they were traveling salesmen. They asked him a lot of questions about his family, finances, and daily life. These visitors would come at random times, always polite, but always looking for information that had no clear business reason. Ezekiel Tanner found out that someone had been breaking into his house while he was away. No one stole anything, but personal items were moved around in ways that made it clear that every room had been thoroughly searched. People left books open to certain pages. People left drawers partially open in patterns that spelled out messages, and they ate a lot of food, which made it seem like they were at home while they were looking for things. Augustus Cromwell discovered. His horse died one morning, probably from natural causes, but it was left in his dooryard in a way that blocked his exit and made him get rid of the body before he could leave. The death happened right before an important court appearance where Cromwell was supposed to testify in another case. This made it seem like the event might not have been completely natural. By January 1888, some of the men who were being targeted had reached their breaking points. Cornelius Ashworth had given up. He left his blacksmith shop and moved his family to Missouri to live with relatives. Silas Peaton had to move to Little Rock after selling his property for a big loss. A traveling doctor said that Jeremiah Quincy had a nervous breakdown and had to stay in bed with his wife and mother. The most troubling thing about the Hatfield campaign, though, was not how well it worked against these specific targets, but how it was documented and improved over time. According to documents found in a cavity wall, Mordecai kept detailed records of every action taken against each target during the demolition of the old Hatfield homestead in 1959. He noted the psychological effects and changed his tactics as needed. The careful handwriting in these records makes them look more like clinical notes than personal revenge notes. He wrote down which methods worked the fastest, which men were better able to handle psychological pressure, and which family members could be used best to put more pressure on. The main goals. One entry from February 15, 1888 says, See, Ashworth left Missouri Territory yesterday. The best way to communicate anonymously was for people who like to be alone. Note that detailed personal knowledge is more unsettling than direct threats. S. Peton needs a different approach because he is social. Destroying someone's reputation is taking longer, but is more complete. Oh, the clinical nature of these observations suggests that the Hatfield family had moved beyond simple revenge into something like psychological experimentation. They seemed to be trying out different ways to mentally force people to do things and keeping track of the results for later use. As winter turned into spring in 1888, the campaign's focus began to shift to the last targets, who had proven to be more resistant to psychological pressure. These men, who may have known what was happening to their neighbors, had begun to take steps to protect themselves. Some had formed informal alliances and were visiting each other, and helped each other out. Some people had contacted county officials, but they weren't very successful because the area was so remote, and it was hard to prove that they were being systematically terrorized. In response to these defensive measures, the Hatfield family stepped up their campaign in ways that went beyond what could be called coincidence or bad luck. For example, farm equipment started breaking down in dangerous ways that could have caused serious injuries. Wells became contaminated with substances that made the water undrinkable, but that could plausibly have occurred through natural contamination. Bridges and fences suffered structural failures that appeared to be the result of natural weathering, but that occurred with suspicious timing and frequency. Throughout this period, the Hatfield family maintained an appearance of normal community involvement. They attended church services, participated in local events, and engaged in ordinary social interactions with neighbors who were not on their target list. This dual existence maintaining normally while conducting systematic psychological warfare required a level of planning and emotional control that speaks to the organized nature of their campaign. Temperance Hatfield's journal entries from this period, discovered among church papers in 1965, provide insight into the family dynamics during the campaign. Rather than expressing guilt or concern about their actions, the entries reveal a family that had convinced itself that. Morai wrote in March 1888, "A man who takes what belongs to another has already chosen to live outside the protection of decent society." The boys understand this. We are not hurting innocent people. We are just letting guilty men feel the effects of their own choices. This way of thinking seems to have been shared by all family members and may have been important in keeping their psychological stability while conducting their campaign. By framing their actions as justice rather than revenge, they avoided the moral conflicts that might have undermined their effectiveness. The campaign reached its climax in the spring of 1888, when the remaining targets began disappearing from the county. These were not violent disappearances accompanied by evidence of struggle or foul play. Instead, families simply packed their belongings and left the area, often in the middle of the night, abandoning property and possessions in their haste to escape. Augustus Cromwell left a note explaining why he was leaving, which neighbors found and gave to the county authorities. The note, which is still in the county records, said, "Cannot bear the watching any more. They could be in every shadow. Every sound could be a warning that would take my family where they can't follow." Lumman, similar departures happened all through the spring and summer of 1888. By autumn, all 12 men on Morai's original list had either died, been hurt, or fled the county. Mental breakdown or fleeing the county. The Hatfield family had achieved their goal of making those they held responsible pay for the theft of their still, but they had done so through methods that were arguably more devastating than traditional violence. The effectiveness of their campaign created a lasting impact on the community that extended far beyond the immediate targets. Other families in the county became acutely aware of the price of crossing the Hatfield clan and began modifying their behavior accordingly. People who might have settled disagreements by fighting or going to court now avoided doing so altogether. The psychological terrorism campaign had created a climate of fear that affected how people interacted with each other for years to come. County officials tried to look into the pattern of people leaving and having mental breakdowns, but they ran into the same problems that had made it hard for law enforcement during the frontier period. The area was remote, and there was no direct evidence of criminal activity, and the unwillingness of terrorized families to give detailed testimony made it impossible to build a case against the Hatfield family. Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood, whose jurisdiction included Newton County, filed a report with state authorities in September of 1888, asking for help in investigating what he called systematic intimidation and coercion by the Hatfield family. The report, which was found in state archives in 1961, is one of the few official acknowledgments of the campaign's success. While no. Blackwood wrote that the pattern of psychological distress, property abandonment, and population displacement in the vicinity of the Hatfield property strongly suggests organized intimidation. This is because there is no direct evidence of illegal activity. The family has used fear to get what they want, which is something that other people might do with violence. However, the law doesn't give them many options for dealing with this kind of behavior. Was minimal. In October 1888, a single investigator was sent to Newton County, but his 2 investigations found no evidence of specific criminal acts. The investigator's report, which is also in state archives, noted the unusual number of recent property transfers and relocations in the area, but it concluded that while these events were suspicious, they did not provide enough evidence of criminal behavior to warrant prosecution. After the state investigation, the Hatfield family gradually reduced their visibility in the community. They stopped going to social events, limited their interactions with neighbors, and went back to being alone, which had been their way of life before their still was stolen. This withdrawal was not complete invisibility, but rather a strategic reduction in contact that kept their psychological presence while limiting their exposure to further official scrutiny. The final phase of the campaign occurred in late 1888 and early 1889 when the few remaining men. People who were on Mordai's original list but hadn't yet left the county started to feel completely cut off from society and the economy. Businesses wouldn't serve them, neighbors avoided them, and even family members started to distance themselves from them to avoid being linked to the curse that seemed to follow anyone who had crossed the Hatfield family. This social exile may have been worse than the earlier psychological terrorism because it took away the last bits of normalcy, human contact, and community support. The men were outcasts in their own communities and couldn't do business, keep relationships, or take part in the social structures that made frontier life what it was. Jeremiah Quincy, who stayed in the county even after his nervous breakdown, wrote the most detailed account of this last phase in letters to relatives in other states. These letters, which were found among family papers in 1964, describe a gradual descent into complete social invisibility. "No one talks to me anymore," he wrote in December 1888. "When I go into the general store, other customers leave. The shopkeeper helps me, but won't look me in the eye. My neighbors walk by my house without saying anything, as if I have died but am still alive. I start to see why the others left. This is not how God wanted things to be." The last letter Quincy wrote was to his sister in Missouri on January 15, 1889. "I can't stay here any longer. The weight of their attention has become too much to bear. I know they are watching, even when I can't see them. I know they're listening even when I don't hear anything. A man can't live with so much attention on him without going crazy. Tomorrow, I'm going to places where their eyes can't follow me." Mordai Hatfield's campaign of revenge ended when Quincy left. He had driven all 12 of the men he thought had stolen his still out of the county, or made them so mentally ill that they didn't pose any more of a threat to his family's interests. The campaign took 18 months to finish and was done with such careful planning that it showed a deep understanding of how people think and how society works. The effects of the campaign on Newton County were long-lasting and lasted for decades. The sudden departure of 12 families, along with their extended families and close friends, greatly reduced the area's population and changed its economy. Structure. A lot of businesses went out of business because they didn't have enough customers, and the people who stayed became much more closed off and careful when dealing with outsiders. The Hatfield family's psychological techniques became part of local folklore and changed how people in the county handled disagreements for many years after that. The fear of being the target of similar psychological warfare was a strong reason not to confront someone directly, which led to a culture of indirect communication and being very careful not to do anything that could be seen as hostile. The Hatfield family stayed in Newton County until Moonshine died in 1902. For the rest of his life, he acted like a good father who had successfully protected his family's interests from people who wanted to take advantage of them. His sons kept working in the county, but they had a reputation for being methodically ruthless, which meant that they were rarely challenged. Straight. Temperance Hatfield's later journal entries, which cover the years 1890 to her death in 1895, show that she had become more and more alone because she knew what her family had done. Even though she kept saying that what they did was morally right, her writing shows that she was becoming less sure about the psychological costs of their campaign, both for their targets and for themselves. Moonshine talks a lot about justice being served, she wrote in 1893. But I sometimes think about whether we have changed. We did something other than what God wanted when we chose to answer theft with such total destruction. The men who hurt us are gone, but the pain of their leaving stays with us. We live in a county that is afraid of us, and sometimes I don't know if fear and respect are the same thing. The story of the Ozark Massacre, as it was known in local folklore, was mostly forgotten outside of Newton County until 1959, when the original Hatfield homestead was torn down and the story was found again, of Moonshine thorough records. These papers, along with the many journals, letters, and official reports that came out in the next 10 years, gave the first full picture of what really happened during those 18 months in 1887 and 1888. Dr. Harrison Metaf, a psychology professor at the University of Arkansas who looked into the case in 1967, said that the Hatfield campaign was one of the most advanced examples of systematic psychological warfare in American frontier history. His study, which came out in an academic journal that year, said that the family had used psychological techniques that clinical psychology wouldn't fully understand for many years. The Hatfield family showed that they understood isolation anxiety, social ostracism, and psychological manipulation. This could mean that they had either a very good natural understanding of human psychology or had used these methods before. Metaf said, their ability to keep the campaign going. Over a long time, while avoiding direct criminal exposure, this shows planning and emotional control that is close to the level of organized psychological operations. The case caught the attention of federal researchers in the late 1960s who were looking at historical examples of psychological warfare for military use. But their results were classified, so civilian researchers can't see them. Some have conjectured that the Hatfield methods impacted subsequent military psychological operations. Training, a sociological study done by graduate students from the University of Arkansas in 1965, showed how the Ozark Massacre affected the people who lived there for a long time. The study found that residents of Newton County still had higher than normal levels of social anxiety, distrust of outsiders, and avoidance behavior 77 years after the events. This was compared to residents of nearby counties. Interviews conducted during this study revealed that narratives concerning the Hatfield. For 3 generations, families had passed down the campaign, often adding details that made it more psychologically powerful. Many people who lived there said that as kids, they were told not to draw attention to themselves or make enemies, and that these warnings were directly related to what happened to the 12 men who had crossed the Hatfield family. Researchers talked to an old man whose grandfather lived next door to the Hatfields. He said, "My granddaddy always said there were things worse than dying, and that the Hatfields knew what those things were." He said, "A man could lose everything that made life worth living without ever being touched by a hand or threatened with a weapon." That lesson stuck with my family, and I think it stuck with other people as well. People in the area stayed away from the site of the Hatfield homestead until the 1960s. Even though the land was worth a lot of money for farming or building, no one bought it after the family left it. Local real estate agents said that possible. People who wanted to buy the land would back out of their offers after learning about the history of the area and how many times people had tried to develop it, but had to give up because workers didn't want to stay on the site. As part of a bigger study of how people settled on the frontier, a group of researchers from the Smithsonian Institution tried to do an archaeological survey of the Hatfield property in 1967. After 3 weeks, the project was stopped because team members said they were feeling unusual psychological stress while working at the site. The person in charge of the project. The final report submitted to the Smithsonian in December 1967 indicated that team members encountered difficulties in sleeping, heightened anxiety, and enduring sensations of being observed while working at the site. The report said, "The consistency of symptoms among team members suggests that the location itself may have retained some environmental factor that negatively impacts human psychological well-being. This means that we can't say for sure what caused these psychological effects. Psychological trauma linked to this site, we suggest that additional archaeological efforts be deferred indefinitely." Academic interest in the case progressively diminished during the late 1960s and early 1970s as original documents became more challenging to obtain. Some important records went missing from archives for reasons that were never made clear, and family members of both the Hatfields and their targets were less willing to help researchers. Most of the physical evidence was gone by 1970. Of the case had been lost, destroyed, or made hard to get to. The federal government bought the original homestead site to include it in a national forest preserve, which stopped any further archaeological work. In 1968, a fire at the county courthouse destroyed a lot of the historical archive, including most of the documents related to the Hatfield case. The few researchers who kept looking into the case ran into the same kind of planned interference that had been present in the first events. The equipment would break down. Access permissions would be taken away without warning, and key sources would go missing just before interviews were supposed to take place. Even though there were no direct threats, the pattern of interference was so strong that many researchers thought they were being intentionally stopped from doing their work. Dr. Harrison Metaf's 1967 analysis was the most thorough academic study of the. He tried to publish a follow-up paper in 1972, but the journal that had published his first work was no longer interested in the topic. Other academic journals also turned down his manuscript because they were worried about historical accuracy and academic relevance. Metaf's unpublished manuscript found among his papers after his death in 1984 indicates that his ongoing research had revealed links between the Hatfield case and analogous instances of systemic, psychological terrorism in other border areas. His notes show that he had started to think that the Hatfield family's methods were not new ideas, but rather adaptations of methods that other families and groups had used during the American frontier period. He wrote in one part of the manuscript that the Hatfield psychological operations were so advanced that they may have been more common in frontier society than people had thought before. The seclusion of frontier communities, the ineffectiveness of law enforcement, and the necessity for deterrent measures against prospective threats may have contributed to the emergence of systematic psychological warfare techniques that have been predominantly neglected by conventional historical research. Metaf's research notes also suggest that he had found similar cases in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, all involving extended family groups that had used psychological terrorism to get rid of threats that they thought were real, staying out of the direct criminal court. But we don't know the details of these other cases because his research materials went missing from the university archives after he died. The last serious academic study of the Ozark Massacre was done in 1978 by a group of researchers from the University of Missouri. They tried to confirm the basic facts of the case by talking to older people who lived in Newton County at the time. The project was stopped after 6 months because the research team couldn't find someone who is willing to talk about what happened in detail. The project leader's last report to the university in 1979 said that even though the residents clearly knew about the historical events, they were strangely unwilling to give specific information, even about things that happened before they were born. Despite evidence that their families had been directly affected by the events, many people who could have been interviewed said they didn't know anything about the case. The amount of silence about this. The report said that this historical event is different from anything we have seen in other oral history projects. People who live there now, even those whose families moved there decades after the events, are hesitant to talk about them. This suggests that the community has developed cultural ways to avoid talking about these specific historical events. More than 100 years after the Ozark Massacre, the case is still mostly forgotten outside of Newton County, and even in the county, it exists more like stories than real history. The few records that still exist are spread out across different archives and private collections, which makes it almost impossible to do a full analysis. The places where the events took place are now part of federal land, or have been developed for other uses, which has erased most of the evidence of the original settlement patterns. But the case's psychological effects still have an effect on the culture of Newton County in small ways. People who live there still show higher than normal levels of social caution, indirect ways of talking to each other and not wanting to fight directly. Local police say that property crime and fights between people are very low, which could be because the Hatfield case had a long-lasting effect on crime rates. The story of Maury Hatfield and his planned campaign of psychological revenge is a disturbing reminder of how cruel people can be when they plan it. The Hatfield family showed that it was possible to destroy lives, families, and whole communities without using direct violence. Communities by using fear, isolation, and psychological pressure on a regular basis. What is most troubling is that their methods worked not only on their immediate targets, but also on the behavior of the community as a whole, which lasted for generations. The Ozark Massacre is an example of how psychological terrorism can be used to control people by making them afraid and showing that standing up to certain people or families will lead to worse than death itself. The 12 men who went missing in Newton County in 1887 and 1888 weren't killed in the usual way, but they were effectively killed off as if they had been shot or hanged. Their deaths are a reminder that human cruelty can be much more subtle and, some might say, more harmful than direct violence. And that the American frontier gave rise to not only legendary gunfighters and violent criminals, but also people who could. Psychological warfare methods that would work just as well in today's military or intelligence operations. The real horror of the Ozark Massacre isn't what happened to the 12 men, but how completely and systematically it was done. This is because there is evidence that these kinds of things may have happened more often in frontier society than traditional historical accounts say. The Hatfield family's campaign gives us a look at a darker side of American frontier psychology, one that shows the possibility for regular families to become tools of planned psychological harm when they think they are protecting their own interests. The silence that has surrounded this case for over 100 years may be part of the Hatfield legacy, a psychological scar that affects the whole community and still affects behavior long after the people who did it and the people who were hurt have died. In a society that values direct action and clear moral lines, the Ozark Massacre serves as a reminder. We are reminded that the most destructive types of human conflict may be those that occur beneath the surface in the areas of fear, uncertainty, and psychological manipulation, where conventional ideas of justice and law enforcement have little power to intervene. People still tell this story in Arkansas's mountains, in the whispered warnings that have been passed down from generation to generation, in the caution that governs how people interact with each other, and in the knowledge that some families have. Skills that go far beyond what their looks might suggest. The Hatfield name may not scare people in Newton County anymore, but the methods they came up with are still used as a model for psychological dominance that doesn't need any weapons other than patience, intelligence, and an understanding of how much people need to feel accepted and safe in their community.